Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome back to AJ 101 Criminal Law Online. Tonight's lecture is going to cover Chapter 5, and it's going to be covering parties to a crime. It is kind of a short chapter, so I'm going to concentrate a little bit on some of the bigger pieces, and some of the smaller things I will leave up to you to kind of read and make sure that you're kind of staying up to date. So do read your textbook, and I'll give you some guidance on things I want you to look at as we're going through, that you could read on your own, and it won't take up time during the lecture here. So we're going to start off with parties to a crime. So who are they? And you know, you've probably heard the phrases accessories and principals, accessory after the fact and before the fact, and you know, code principals and accomplices and all those different things. So we're going to kind of get to the bottom of a lot of these things, and you have to understand though that they're all like separate, but they kind of weave themselves together, so they're sort of close in some areas, and I'll try to break it down to you to where you can get an understanding on each one is. If you took the terminology quiz that I posted for this chapter, you'll have a little bit of a better understanding on the definition of each one, which I think will really help you. So here we go. So, principles of shared liability. So, not only those who actually commit the crime, but also those who assist in its commission or help the suspect evade justice are criminally liable. So, not just the suspect is criminally liable, or one that assumes criminal liability. Okay, for example, if a person who commits a robbery is aided by a getaway driver and then is subsequently hidden from law enforcement by friends or relatives, all of these parties are criminally accountable for their actions. Now we'll dive into the definitions in a little bit here, but aiders and abettors are those who help the perpetrator commit the crime, maybe like a getaway driver. Accessories are those who assist the perpetrator or the suspect maybe after the crime in order to help them avoid apprehension. Those are accessories, and all of these folks may be punished under law. So, you know, remember here, the actual perpetrator or suspect of a crime is not the only one who assumes some liability, criminal liability, which means punishment. And those who aid that suspect before, during, and after a crime can also be held liable, criminally culpable, if you will. And also those who harbor or conceal or hide the suspect in order to help them avoid apprehension, they too can also be liable. So we'll start off with principal, and not a school principal, a principal as defined in Penal Code 31. This section states, and I'll read it to you and then we'll break it down a little bit. All persons concerned in the commission of a crime, whether it be a felony or a misdemeanor, or whether they directly commit the act constituting the offense, or aid and abet in its commission, or not being present, interesting, have advised and encouraged its commission. And all persons counseling, advising, or encouraging children under the age of 14 years, or persons who are mentally incapacitated to commit any crime, or who by fraud, contrivance, or force occasion the drunkenness of another, get somebody drunk, for the purpose of causing him or her to commit any crime, or who by threats, menace, command, or coercion compel another to commit any crime, are principals in any crime so committed. So, excuse me, the list here kind of breaks it down for you, but I kind of read everything that really is on this list. So that person that directly commits the act, that person that aids or abets its commission, not being present, kind of a cool thing, but advise or encourage. Counsel, advise, encourage those under 14, advise those who are mentally incapacitated by fraud, contrivance, threats, or coercion. All of these are principles. Now, there was this time when we had like more things to think about with the law. And Penal Code 971 is basically titled Distinctions Nullified, meaning that we took a couple things away. The law did. It kind of packaged them a little bit better. So it eliminates the old common law distinctions of two certain terms. Now, when we talk about principles, which we already did, and accessories, which we'll get to, there used to be principle in the first degree, principle in the second degree, one higher than the other, if you will, accessory before the fact, before the crime happened, accessory after the fact, after the crime happened. Now this distinctions nullified basically says, hey, you know what? We're just going to use two terms here now. We're going to have Penal Code 31 that defines what a principle is, and we're going to have Penal Code 32 that defines what an accessory is, and we're not going to have all the other stuff. So now there's just two. So pretty self-explanatory, but it does help you at least kind of understand what it is when we're talking about principles and accessories. So what are the elements of a principle, of being a principle? So as noted in Penal Code 31, all persons involved in any way in the planning, preparation, or carrying out of any crime become principals. This is true even if they are not present at the time the crime is committed. So that's kind of interesting. Now, the key elements here are, well, first of all, it applies to all crimes, okay, felony, misdemeanor, and infraction. And the key elements, however, are first that aid and abets in the commission of a crime. Second, advises and encourages its commission, even if not present. Third, fraudulently gets another person drunk for the purpose of causing that person to commit a crime. And four, compels another to commit a crime by threats, menace, or coercion. Now, the first sentence of Penal Code 31, you need to know, says, and it reads like this: all persons concerned in the commission of a crime, whether it be felony or misdemeanor, means that the designation principle really applies to all crimes, misdemeanors, infractions, and felonies, and we'll talk more about that. One interesting kind of note here, though, is that aiders and abettors and accessories may be tried and convicted even if the actual principal suspect is not. So let's say the suspect gets off, but you could be tried as an aider and abettor, or you could be tried as an accessory and convicted. So just, understand that's why these are separate pieces. Even though they kind of all sort of fit together, they're all very, very separate. Now, this is one of those things where I'm going to have you kind of look up on your own. So there are penal code provisions, meaning other sections of the California Penal Code, that define certain parties to a crime that I'm not going to spend a lot of time on because I want to focus on some of the bigger pieces, but it's good for you to look at. So examples, Penal Code 27 talks about persons liable to punishment. You can look at 655, acts punishable under foreign law. And again, all of these things that are there, they're there for your information, and I'm going to move on to something kind of a bigger chunk as we're talking about things during this chapter. So let's talk now about aiding and abetting. What really is it? We talked about principles, so we know what that is. We know what the elements of a principle are, and now what does that aiding and abetting thing kind of actually mean? So a person aids and abets the commission of a crime if, with knowledge of the unlawful purpose of the suspect of the crime, he or she promotes, encourages, assists, or instigates by act or advice the commission of such crime. So an aider and abettor is one who does not actually perpetrate the crime, but assists in the commission of the criminal offense. Does that make sense? And persons may be found guilty of aiding and abetting only if it can be shown that, first, they have knowledge of the unlawful purpose. Second, they share the same criminal intent as the suspect. And then third, act, advise, supply, etc., or assist in some way. Now, I want to kind of talk about a a case study real quick about not being present and advised. So Penal Code 31, the District Court of Appeal in the case of People versus Lewis said to be a principle, it is not necessary that the person be present at the commission of the crime. So this People versus Lewis case, very, very interesting. So in the Lewis case, the defendant was charged with the crime of rape upon a child under the age of 16 years. The jury returned a verdict of guilty as charged. The defendant appealed from the order denying his motion for a new trial from the final judgment of conviction. The victim was the stepdaughter of the defendant. There was no evidence that the defendant had sexual intercourse with her or that he was present at the commission of the crime. However, there was abundant evidence that he aided and abetted its commission by one Alan Wheeler, a youth of 17 years of age. The defendant's contention was that since he was not present when the crime was committed, the evidence must be held to be insufficient to justify the verdict. Well, the evidence was that the defendant on several occasions solicited this Wheeler youngster to have sexual intercourse with the defendant's stepdaughter. He brought them together under circumstances calculated to basically arouse passion and to bring about his wicked design. He advised Wheeler to procure certain items to be used in the act of intercourse if necessary. He procured medicated capsules and gave them to the female, to the stepdaughter, and showed her how to use them. So there was evidence that the defendant took his stepdaughter and Wheeler to San Francisco for the purpose of encouraging them to have sex. So the first night that they occupied a small room, which only had one bed and three, all three slept in it. The second night they were occupied in a different room, which there were two beds. The defendant slept in one and Wheeler and the young girl slept in the other. So at the end of the day here, the court held that there was ample evidence to convict Lewis of unlawful sexual intercourse as a principle. But think about it, he wasn't even there. So again, just kind of, you have to look at how the law works and the intent of the law. And that's why it's important that you read and that you look at some of these case studies. And another one that's kind of interesting, it's in your book, it's on page 64. So it's People versus Wood. Now, in the case of People versus Wood, the court said that where a person knowingly provides a room for another to commit unlawful sexual intercourse, both are guilty as being principals to the crime. Wow. Okay. So in this case, the defendant and one James Moore were jointly charged with the crime of committing statutory rape, now unlawful sexual intercourse. The case was dismissed against Moore, but not Woods, who was an adult. Now, upon trial, Woods was convicted. He appealed his conviction and 9-month sentence in the county jail. Now, Woods' chief contention was that the verdict was not warranted by the evidence. It is conceded that Wood did not have sexual intercourse with the girl involved. However, it conclusively appeared from the evidence that one evening Wood met Moore and the other girl together, and that he would, at the request of Moore, procured a room for their use. Wood took Moore and the girl to the room where the two spent the remainder of the night. In the morning, as agreed, Wood returned and awakened them. As shown by the evidence, Wood knew the illegal purpose for which the room was to be used and knowingly both aided and abetted Moore in the commission of the crime. Now, there was a lot of names going back and forth. I know that's confusing, but the conviction actually was sustained. So we see, therefore, that a person may be convicted as a principal, even though not present at the actual commission of the offense. So, wow. it's just good to know those kinds of things. So moving on, after a couple of quick little kind of case studies, which are super interesting. Criminal street gangs. So all gang members who knowingly promote, further assist in felonious activity by the gang are guilty of a felony. So this is what they call the street gang enhancement. It's Penal Code Section 186.22. And again, talks about all gang members who knowingly promote, further, or assist in felonious activity by the gang are guilty of a felony. Drive-by shootings, dope sales, everything else. This can result in life in prison, and they must register with police as a gang member for a period of 5 years. So there are certain enhancements that you will see as we talk about different laws, and one of those is here in that criminal street gang kind of liability section, if you will. After conviction, actually, they have to register just like a narcotics registrant or a sex registrant or what have you. Okay, so we kind of we went through principles. We know the elements now. We talked about aiding and abetting a little bit and went over a couple of little case studies, if you will. So what's a co-principal, and why does, what does it mean, and how does it fit? Well, I'll give you some examples as well. But so all parties who are legally principals under the law are equally guilty. Okay, so for example, a person who serves as a lookout for a burglary or robbery is as guilty of the offense as his partners, if you will, who entered and completed the crimes. So again, that means a lookout can get the same amount of prison time as the actual one who goes in and does the robbery. All parties to crimes are responsible for their natural, reasonable, and probable consequences. So that's a case, People versus Goldstein, that really kind of, obviously the lookout knows what the person is doing that's going into the bank, that's robbing the bank or robbing the liquor store or committing the burglary or what have you. So keep in mind this co-principal section. Now there is an exception though, okay, to that co-principal piece. And so on July 2nd, 1982, the United States Supreme Court struck down the death penalty for what they call non-triggerman criminals who did not intend to take part in a killing, but whose crimes resulted in death. So the case is Edmond versus Florida, 485 U.S. 782, and it was a very sharply divided court that ruled that the imposition of death under such circumstances violates the Constitution's ban on cruel and unusual punishment, and this rule still stands today. So co-principals equally guilty with an exception, okay, that non-triggerman principle. So again, the U.S. Supreme Court struck down the death penalty for a non-triggerman criminal who did not intend to take part in the killing, but whose crime resulted in death. Now, they can still be prosecuted, okay, so don't confuse that. But if these elements fit, then they can't be, they're not going to get the same as the trigger man, if that's kind of the easiest way to sort of say it. So, in this though, there was a question of intent in this case, in this Edmond decision that overturned the death penalty imposed on the Florida death row inmate Earl Edmond for participation in a robbery during which an elderly couple was killed. And the justice, just to give you a little bit more meat because this is a shorter chapter, Justice Byron White wrote, "Putting Edmond to death to avenge two killings that he did not commit and had no intention of committing or causing does not measurably contribute to the retributive end of ensuring that the criminal gets his, quote, just deserts." White said that it must be shown that the defendants, like Edmond, intended or contemplated that a life should be taken. So basically, Edmund said that he helped plan the robbery of the Kersey's home in Florida, but he did not know that his accomplices would gun down the couple. And that's kind of how this opinion for this non-triggerman opinion came about. So remember, co-principals equally guilty with an exception in there. Okay, so let's move on to accessory. So we did principals. We did the, what else did we do? We did the co-principals. We kind of know what that means. We did the aid and abet, so we're kind of there with those. And now let's talk about an accessory. Well, what the heck is an accessory? Well, Penal Code 32 describes an accessory as, okay, every person who, after a felony has been committed, harbors, conceals, or aids a principal, we know what a principal is, in such felony with the intent that the said principal may avoid or escape from arrest, trial, conviction, or punishment, having knowledge, okay, that said principal has committed such felony or has been charged with such felony or convicted thereof, is an accessory to such felony. So if you didn't know, like in that one case, I believe in a previous chapter where we talked about the Booth killing of Lincoln, if Mudd, okay, Dr. Mudd, I believe was his name, didn't know that Booth did that, then see, he really wouldn't be an accessory. So there are some things that have to fall together. So hopefully you kind of pick that up. Now, as has been stated before, there's no longer an accessory before or after the fact in California. We only have one type of accessory defined in Penal Code 32, okay? So we rarely use the terms before the fact, you know, or after the fact or whatever. Principal is principal, accessory is an accessory. So just kind of remember that, okay? So one who aids a principal to avoid apprehension, the requirements are after a felony, okay, not a misdemeanor. So know that. Knowledge is required. They have to know, not just a rumor, they have to know that person will harbor, meaning furnish, shelter, lodge, food, whatever, conceal, hide, or something similar, is an accessory. Okay, now if the person has been charged, there's a formal complaint that's been issued, then that's the same thing, where you could be held as an accessory. The crime of being an accessory is punishable as a felony wobbler, and I believe that we've heard that term before, which means that it can be a felony or a misdemeanor. Okay, does that kind of get all that together? So I think we kind of got that. So we have accessory. So not too bad. So now accessory, well, what about an accomplice? Where does that come in now? So how do we kind of fit that in? Okay, so let's look at accomplice. So Penal Code 1111, one who is liable to prosecution for the identical offense charged against the defendant on trial in the cause in which the testimony of the accomplice is given. Now I know that's confusing, but I'm going to help you out here, so don't worry. To be an accomplice, the person must have aided or assisted in the offense with the knowledge of the unlawful purpose. An accomplice is, in effect, a principal to the crime. A conviction cannot be had upon the testimony of an accomplice without some type of corroboration. And you'll get these in like gang cases. So let me kind of go back around a little bit so you can kind of wrap your head around this, because I know it's kind of crazy. Penal Code Section 1111 defines an accomplice as one who is liable to prosecution for the identical offense charged against the defendant on trial in the cause in which the testimony of the accomplice is given. To be an accomplice, the person must have aided, promoted, encouraged, or instigated by act or advice the commission of an offense with knowledge of the unlawful purpose of the person who was or who committed the offense. Okay, a person who knowingly, voluntarily, and with common intent with the principal offender unites in the commission of the crime is an accomplice. Okay, he or she is in effect a principal to the crime. One can be an accomplice to felonies, misdemeanors, and infractions. I know it's confusing, it's the law. But now you have to remember there needs to be cooperation. So when you look at accomplice, sometimes it's like two people that plan the crime or whatever, and they start to carry out the crime. One person decides to carry out the crime, and the other guy, gets caught or whatever, and then he rats on the other guy, or they both get caught, and one kind of rats on the other one. So accomplice usually, obviously, kind of means more than one here, but you need cooperation. So just the statement of one, you can't get a conviction, okay, just based on the testimony of an accomplice. So I'm going to rat out my buddy because we planned this thing together, and I'm just going to testify him again. You need some type of cooperation. Okay, so Penal Code 1111 also says a conviction cannot be had upon the testimony of an accomplice unless it be corroborated by such other evidence as shall tend to connect the defendant with the commission of the offense. So you need some kind of other corroborating evidence. Does that make sense? Okay, and corroboration, all right, is defined as independent evidence that tends to connect the defendant with the commission of the crime, with the commission of the offense. This independent evidence must be something other than testimony of an accomplice. Okay? So hopefully that kind of gets that information a little bit clearer when it comes to accomplice and what have you. So there's this other kind of weird thing in there, okay? When we talk about accomplice, there's something called a feigned accomplice. And this one, though, it'll be easier for you to kind of understand and keep track of. So this is one who participates in a crime for evidence gathering and prosecution purposes. This type of accomplice fundamentally lacks criminal intent because they're assisting for justice purposes, meaning that maybe undercover police officers, those working under the direction of law enforcement. So let's say you had an informant that went in and was actually there watching somebody commit a crime or packaging narcotics to help somebody before they're going to go sell a bunch of drugs or things like that, but they're informing for you as a law enforcement officer. They're working for the police. That's a feigned accomplice. So while they are technically committing a crime, they fall underneath the feigned accomplice rule, if you will. Okay, so that's one who participates in a crime for evidence gathering and prosecution purposes. Okay, so hopefully that kind of clears that one up as well. So let me hit you with one other real quick discussion point, and then we'll be done for this one. So there are some situations in California where a participant in a crime cannot be an accomplice. And an example would be in unlawful sexual intercourse. So Penal Code 261.5, for example, the prosecution, the victim being under the statutory age of consent cannot be an accomplice, if that kind of makes sense. The victim, let's say, of a violation of Penal Code 288, lewd acts against a child, being under the age of 14 cannot be an accomplice. Okay. If the offense is also a violation of Penal Code 288A, oral copulation, and the child under 14 was a willing participant in forcing another to participate, and it could be proven satisfactorily by the evidence that he knew the wrongfulness of the act at the time that he did it, he would then be an accomplice insofar as 288. And I know that's kind of confusing, but I wanted to make sure that we at least kind of got that discussion point out there. So that is it for parties to a crime. Again, read your terminology sheets that I gave you so you have the definitions kind of down a little bit, and you have a better understanding on those items that we covered. So we covered principles, okay, under Penal Code Section 31, and we talked about the elements of that. We talked about aiding and abetting and what that really meant. And we did a couple of case studies on not being present, but also being a principal, if you will. And we talked a little bit about encouraging others to commit crimes, and we talked about that criminal street gang liability, and also the co-principal equality issue, with the one exception of the non-trigger man. We went over accessories and talked about knowledge required and what harboring is and concealing and what have you. We also just kind of finished up with an accomplice and what that is. So hit your terminology quiz so you have a good idea on what those are, and I think that will help you. And that'll be it for Chapter 5. If you have any questions, post them on the discussion board, and that will be it. So I will talk to you next time.